They sent the notice on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope with the HOA seal and a number that made my stomach drop, $50,000. I still remember sitting at my kitchen table, the morning light cutting across the counter, the paper in my hand, and feeling like someone had reached inside my life and tried to pull a piece of it away. That was the hook, right there, an absurd, impossible number for a single dead tree in my yard, and by the time I'd finished reading, my quiet little street felt like a court of law. My name's Ethan Moore. I live on Juniper Lane in a place called Willow Ridge, 3 bedrooms, a crabapple tree I planted the summer my wife insisted on a vegetable garden. She loved tomatoes more than rules. The HOA president is Margaret Hale, a woman who wears her clipboard like armor and remembers meeting minutes like scripture. She's not a cartoon villain. She's a person who decided rules were her way to be important, and when you pair that with a long-standing feud between her and my neighbor, it becomes combustible. The fine said I'd violated Article 7, Section 12, unauthorized vegetation. In English that meant, cut it down or pay. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. I called, played the part of calm homeowner, asked for clarification. Margaret's voice polite, flat read back the clause as if reading the weather. We're simply enforcing the community standards, she said. There was no warmth in the line. A week later, a second notice arrived, and then, after I put up a small defense photographs, a couple of neighbors vouching I'd owned the tree for 8 years, the tone changed. The notices stopped being polite and started being precise. Deadlines. Penalties. A towing company name that appeared in 3 different paragraphs like a threat. It's funny how small things reveal bigger things. I began to notice patterns. Margaret's sister-in-law ran the landscaping contract for Willow Ridge, and the invoice dates were inconveniently tied to the timing of a lot of fines. A man who'd been an ally on the board suddenly had his yard red tagged for the same violation that had once been shrugged off. There was always a justification. The bylaws were clear, the regulations were uniform until they weren't. That's when it stopped being about a tree and started being about power. Once you smell leverage, people show their teeth. The first escalation was petty. Anonymous complaints filed about my mailbox, then about the color of my garage door. Someone left a flyer on my car about community standards with a photo of my driveway circled. I started getting calls late at night from unknown numbers. Nothing threatening overtly, just heavy breathing and then silence when I answered. My wife, Sarah, tightened up, her patience turning to a careful vigilance I couldn't fully read. She wanted to keep the salads and the peace. I wanted to know why a tree could cost us the roof over our heads. I'm not a litigator. I'm a dad who taught his daughter how to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac and who fixed his own leaky faucet. But I also know when someone is trying to move the goalposts. So I started keeping records, photos with timestamps, voice memos from meetings, emails cross-referenced with town permit histories. I discovered a thread. The board had held what they called an emergency meeting last spring to pass a vendor contract that would centralize all exterior maintenance, and the meeting notice had been posted late and only to a subset of homeowners. That's not just sloppy, that's a breach of procedure. When I brought it up at the next monthly meeting, the room felt smaller than it had to fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a table covered with coffee cups, and clipped agendas. Margaret's smile was practiced. She had an answer for everything. Procedures were followed, she said. We found a consensus. A few neighbors shifted in their seats. One of them, Royce, who lives 2 doors down and whose wife had once run for the board, raised his hand and asked for the meeting minutes. Margaret's expression changed for a second, a small, human flash, and then she was immediately the officer again, composed, unbothered. People clapped when she finished. It felt choreographed. That night, I replayed the meeting in my head, and I thought about why someone would weaponize community rules. It wasn't just control, it was money, influence, and the comfort of being ringmaster to everyone else's lives. Margaret had reasons that looked reasonable on paper: uniformity, property values, community cohesion. But beneath the veneer was a calculation. If certain yards were fenced in by rules, vendors would prosper, and with those vendors came favors, and with those favors came loyalty. The pattern was ugly, but it fit. So I pushed. I filed a formal appeal, citing poor notice, inconsistent enforcement, and procedural lapses. I reached out to a lawyer, a local woman named Claire Harlow, who smelled red tape from a mile off and who asked, the first time we met, whether I wanted to make noise or fix the problem quietly. I said I wanted to fix something that felt wrong, but I knew the only way was to make visible what had been happening in the shadows. When you start poking the hornet's nest, everything accelerates. Margaret called me into her office. The HOA office is a converted little house with a flag in the yard and a couch that sags like it has secrets. She invited me to sit, then proceeded to tell me, in a voice that tried to be reasonable, that I was making things worse for the neighborhood. "We have standards, Ethan," she said. "Standards protect us." I looked at her and said, softly, "What protects us from abuse of those standards?" Her lips tightened. She told me to watch my tone. It was the first time I felt my face heat in front of a woman who wanted to be judge and jury. The key scene, the one you'd give for a cinematic moment, was the hearing. The hall was packed, folding chairs shoulder to shoulder, the fluorescent lights humming like a bad memory. Neighbors I'd waved to 100 times sat there with their arms folded, phones ready. Margaret sat at the head with a stack of documents that smelled faintly of ink and inevitability. Claire had me stand and present our case. Procedural violations, a pattern of selective enforcement, invoices linking vendors to the board. I spoke, and my voice shook once, then steadied. I remember the hush when Louis stood and read the line from his file, the one about the emergency meeting notice posted 2 days late. There was a rustle of surprise, then murmurs. Margaret tried to turn it. She accused us of grandstanding, of trying to bully the board. She read the bylaws in a voice that tried to be biblical. Then someone in the back, Mrs. Keene, who'd lived on Juniper Lane for 30 years and tended her roses like a small country, stood up and said, "This isn't about bylaws. This is about people." That line landed. It changed the energy in the room. The climax came in a way that felt earned rather than theatrical. The board voted a narrow margin to refer the contract for outside review and to put several enforcement decisions on hold pending an independent audit. Margaret lost her chair by a sliver, a procedural vote that undercut her authority without a single shouted accusation. She left the dais where she had sat like a conductor and walked out with a face so composed it looked carved. Later, in the parking lot, 2 people argued, not physically, words like flint striking steel. Margaret called me a troublemaker. I called back that she'd weaponized the neighborhood. Her parting line was simple and cold. "You'll regret making enemies in a small town." We won that round, but the aftermath felt like stepping out into fog. The fine was rescinded officially. The board said due process was missing. They issued a public notice about improved transparency. Vendors were put on temporary hold. People came by with casseroles and apologies, and the kind of awkward hugs that mean, "We didn't know." Claire told me to expect resistance for months. She said institutions don't like being exposed. She was right. Here's the part that keeps me up sometimes. The final scene isn't tidy. 2 months later, an anonymous letter appeared on the community board at the mailbox cluster, a note about upholding standards, with a poem stapled to it. Someone painted graffiti on the back of the HOA, shed a childish, sharp tag that said, "Watch us." And 3 weeks after that, a parcel arrived at my house with a solicitation from the landscaping company Margaret had favored. The timing was a sneer. The community had shifted, a little, toward openness, but shadows lingered. Change had happened, but it wasn't total. Margaret found a new way to assert herself, quieter, more insidious, networking at PDA meetings, showing up at the town council, smiling with a camera-ready face. If there is a moral, it's not a neat one. Standing up felt right. I couldn't have lived with myself otherwise, but it cost us peace for a while. Sarah worried about our daughter's school friends knowing us as the family who fought the HOA. I worried about being remembered as a troublemaker in a place that prized civility. That tension is the core conflict. Do you preserve harmony by letting things slide, or do you risk rupture to correct an injustice? There's no universal answer. So I'll leave you with a scene. Me, on the front porch at dusk, the crabapple tree's shadow leaning toward the street. Sarah on the step with a cup of tea, the house quiet except for the neighbor's dog 2 houses down. We talk about it sometimes, how small decisions ripple, how a question of a tree became about who gets to decide how people live. I watch the leaves move and think about the email from Claire with a single sentence. Watch the patterns more than the incidents. It was advice that turned out to be the difference between getting angry and getting organized. If you've ever been fined, threatened, or just felt like a rule was being used against you instead of for you, tell me below where you were, what happened, and whether you think I did the right thing. Was I a stubborn fool or someone who drew a line? Do you think communities need stricter oversight or more trust? Drop your story, because I want to read them and because, honestly, I'd like to see if Willow Ridge is an anomaly or a mirror. If you liked hearing this, share it. If you hated the whole thing, say so. Either way, I want to know what you think about rules, power, and the small decisions that end up shaping a neighborhood.